All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of why we care about the business cycle and what some of the implications are and things like that. So I have a little diagram here, and this is sort of just a broad generalization here of, kind of the dips and rises in the economy. So this is sort of representing GDP, and I should note that this is not really drawn to scale and that the increases in GDP tend to be longer and go on for longer, so generally multiple years. And the declines tend to be shorter. So think more 6 months, 9 months, maybe a year. So this is not fully to scale in that sense. And really, there's kind of a longer term trend upward typically in the economy. So generally, if I really wanted to make this more accurate, I'd tilt it to kind of show that even though it's going up and down, it tends to trend upward. So from that standpoint, this is there's some limits to the diagram here, but the idea is to kind of illustrate sort of why we care a little bit about this. And I should preface this by noting that when talking about the business cycle, this is not to suggest that we're going to be able to get to the point where we can tell necessarily the exact top or the exact bottom in the business cycle. That's just not necessarily going to work. But if you can get a sense for sort of what the economic environment is and whether things look positive or negative, and well, that can potentially inform your business decisions and make you a better manager. Not to say that you can figure out the exact top or the exact bottom. Many people have tried to figure out the exact top and bottom and have failed in that endeavor. But if you can get a sense for what looks more like a top or more like a bottom, and perhaps what the environment looks like, then that may influence your ability to make better choices. And so let me kind of give you an illustration of that. So if we look at a lot of companies, I would argue that a fair portion of them, as the economy's been growing and expanding, they hit full capacity after a while of this expansion. So this expansion here, the economic growth, and then they build. So they expand capacity basically. And so like, all right, so they're going to expand the capacity there. But the problem is if you're not careful, you could run into a situation where you hit that full capacity near the end of a business cycle, and then you expand right near the top. And then that new capacity comes online when the economy's already turned and now the economy is sliding into a recession and you now have all this new capacity. And if you think about like, well, why is that a problem? Well, let's think about the mechanics of this. So if I'm expanding all this capacity, there's a fair chance I'm going to borrow money, right? So I'm possibly borrowing money in order to fund the expansion, which means I've got debt. Debt requires interest. Interest is going to have to be paid whether I have a good year or not. So this is financial leverage. Then I also possibly use some of my cash or other resources to pay for this. I also have all this capacity come online, and with all this capacity coming online, there are probably fixed costs associated with this capacity in some form or fashion. And then I go into a recession. So I hit the recession. I don't have as much liquidity because I just bought all this capacity. I have all these fixed interest costs, even if I have a bad year, which I'm about to have a bad year because it's a recession. Then I have all these fixed operating costs, as well as new capacity because I just built this new capacity. So I now have higher costs and less liquidity and in the midst of or in the face of declining demand. That's a bad recipe. So we don't like that. So unfortunately, this can play out if you expand at an inopportune time. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that we can necessarily pick exactly the top or exactly the bottom, and I wouldn't even want anybody to try. But if you can recognize the economic circumstances and kind of realize, just doesn't look great. Maybe I ought to be cautious about this. Let's be careful how much debt I take on for this expansion. Let's kind of run the numbers to see if I do an expansion, just what kind of fixed costs this is going to produce and how well could I handle that if I went through a recessionary kind of environment with my particular business and what's likely to happen to my sales in a recessionary environment. Let's be thoughtful about how we do this to make sure that if we happen to be facing a situation like this, that it's not going to blow up my business and cause me to go under and go bankrupt when I go through the downturn, right? So that's kind of more the idea. It doesn't inherently preclude you from building at any given point, but it's more, let's be thoughtful about that expansion. Let's be careful about the expansion and make sure that we're making prudent choices with this, that it'll be okay if things go down into a downturn, because they might. That kind of thing can happen. that's kind of why we care a little bit about business cycles. We're trying to avoid bad decisions. And there are also some other decisions that I'll talk about in subsequent videos as it relates to the lower parts of the business cycle as well, um, and so on. But thank you so much for watching. I hope this video has been helpful, and have a great day.